This is it. The final design is finally here. Over the last few weeks, I've been working to design what starters might look like from a time period when fossil Pokemon weren't yet rocky husks, but instead still alive and roaming free. I've already completed the grass and fire starters, and if you haven't seen those yet, I definitely recommend you go and take a look. I'll have them linked down in the description below and at the end of this video. Before we get started, I've also got a small addition to offer you. For those of you that were here before, you know that I included a shiny version of the fire starter Scorch. But because it was the first in line, I sort of forgot to do the same for Sproutike, and I didn't think about it until it was already too late. Since then, I've had multiple people ask me about what the shiny version would look like, and so I wanted to offer up some ideas I had for what it could be. I actually have 2 different versions to show, since I couldn't decide which I liked best. First is this verdant green palette. I like to think of it in the same vein as those Pokemon whose shinies don't look much different than their regular versions, except this one is just a tiny bit more noticeable. Instead of a dark emerald green, the color shifts ever so slightly to a brighter shade, the color of grass in the springtime, and the reddish orange on the original shifts to more of a coral hue. I like the subtlety of it, and the more vibrant green really sets it apart from the original. For me, at least. But even though I do enjoy this slight shift, I also wondered what it might look like with more of a drastic color change. Something immediately noticeable to the naked eye. And so the second version is this. Instead of the nice lush green, the color fades and begins to take on more of a dead leaf, brown, woodsy sort of look, and the accent reds become a bright blue. I thought briefly about going for a more autumny orange and red sort of look, but then the idea of dead, crunchy leaves popped into my head, and I couldn't resist. The blue alongside the faded palette is my favorite part about this one. And I still don't know which to choose. What do you think? Is there one you prefer over the other? Moving right along. First, we had a Dillo. Then we had a Trike. And then I warned you that my title might be a bit misleading for the last design. There were a lot of really, really good guesses, but as I'm sure you've all surmised by now from the intro, the final starter design is a pterosaur. Specifically, 3 different types of pterosaur. Let's get this time-lapse rolling and I'll give you the breakdown. Now, before I even started drawing this Pokemon, I knew that I wanted the water starter to be a Tera, but I had no idea what the design would look like, so I started doodling a little off camera, trying to nail some shapes down and looking over various references for the pterosaurs I wanted to base it off of. And before I knew it, I actually had a solid sketch down for the first form that I could use to build off of, so before I took it too far, I opened up OBS and started recording. You can see briefly here my scattered doodles and unrefined thoughts, and then I grab the concept I'm going to be using and start to add more detail to it. The Stage 1 form is based on the genus of pterosaur known as Neurognathus, and more specifically, Neurognathus ammoni, a very small, fuzzy insectivore with huge eyes and a mouth full of sharp, needle-like teeth, perfect for latching onto and ensnaring its prey. Since the base shape of this design is already down, I'm simply going in and refining it at this point, adding tufts of fur, little toes to the back feet, and fleshing out the shape of the wings and tail, which are actually a very important part of its design and have a theme that will tie into its later evolutions. There is a bit of back and forth that happens while I try to figure out a design for the tail, because I thought something different might work better, but in the end I decide that what I've got is actually fine. Same for some of the additional detail added onto the wings. I eventually go back and edit them a bit more, since I want the Stage 1 form to be a simple design, and for the later stages to evolve that detailing as it grows. I play around a lot with the markings before finding something that I think works, but even then you'll see that I make additional changes to it on the finished version because I felt it needed a bit more work once the actual colors had been applied. Then I begin to sketch the final form. This final stage is based on Ornithochirus sinus, a pterosaur with large crested beak tips. To be completely honest with you, I had no idea what I wanted the final design to look like, aside from the fact that I knew it would need to have a large beak, and that I wanted to continue the wing and tail design from the previous 2 stages. It also took me ages to decide on a pose that I liked for this design, as I wanted something that showed it either mid-flight or with the wings spread wide, but I kept having difficulties figuring out where to place the legs so that at least one of them would still be visible and it wouldn't look too awkward in a still image. I'm going to speed through them as best I can, but thought you might enjoy seeing the multitude of poses that I ran through until ultimately landing on one that worked. No pun intended. When I finally do get settled, I begin to add a bit more detail to my sketch, figuring out what sort of look I want this design to have, and adding a few extra bits and bobs here and there to give it shape. This Pokemon is going to have the water and fairy dual typing, and so I want it to show off a bit of that through its traits. The wings and tail will play a large role in this, but other details such as the butterfly patch on the chest and the wing shape of the mask around the eye I'm hoping will contribute nicely as well. A recurring theme you'll notice throughout this design is the butterfly wing shape, and if you're wondering how that ties into the fairy type and not the bug type, my reasoning is that when I think of default fairies, I picture a tiny humanoid with butterfly wings. Medieval fairies, basically. Though I do manage to tie in bugs at the very end during the Pokédex entries. I added a few more tufts of fur around the head to give it shape and to make it look less bald. Add some pattern lines to the neck, and begin to refine the shape of the arms and the wings, and the many insect wings on the tail. My thought with the tail was to make it look like a swarm of butterflies, just because I really like the aesthetic of it, and I think it's really metal. I mean, have you ever seen a swarm of butterflies drinking animal tears? They will literally land on a turtle or an alligator's face and drink the salt from their tears. And the turtles just let them do it, because it helps to clean their eyes or something, I guess. This Pokemon goes from insectivore, eating insects, to piscivore, eating fish, and so I decided to toss in a fish that it might have hunted in ancient times. And when all that's said and done, let's take a look at what exactly we end up with. First is Petrosaur, the tiny wing Pokemon. This tiny Terra Pokemon may look cute, but be warned, it has quite the insatiable appetite. It isn't yet large enough to catch fish like the rest of its flock, so instead it catches small bugs that hang around the water's surface. It can easily cling to the sides of rock walls, trees, and even enjoys clinging to its trainer in the hopes of being given a delicious treat. Beneath the soft fur on its face, it hides a set of needle-sharp teeth, so be sure to watch your fingers when offering food to this little critter. It remembers those who feed it, and once it has grown large enough to, will often reward those who were kind to it when it was small. The best way to this little Pokemon's heart is through its stomach. Next is Ramphoreel, the lure tail Pokemon. This Pokemon by now has eaten so many insects that it has begun to develop bug-like characteristics as it's evolved. It hunts by sticking its long tail into the water like a fishing line, and waiting for small fish to take interest and come poking around. Once it feels the bite of its prey, it quickly snatches them up in its long, hooked beak. It isn't yet large enough to hunt in the deeper waters, and so it sticks around the shallows where the smaller fish reside, occasionally helping to teach younger Petrosaur how to hunt. And finally, we have Delucyrus, the fisher Pokemon. This huge pterosaur is capable of braving even the deepest waters and taking large fish Pokemon as its prey. It's developed a more advanced form of tail lure with which to hunt, and the tiny fragments that shed off from it draw in fish for miles with its irresistibly sweet scent. These unsuspecting fish are then quickly tossed up into the air and gobbled down between jagged-toothed jaws. Despite it being a very adept and serious hunter, this Pokemon is rather nurturing towards those it deems part of its flock, offering food to those smaller than it, and often bringing back generous gifts it finds while out hunting for those who helped it when it was young. For its shiny form, I wanted to do something with the color yellow, and so we have this. I think it makes it look a lot more like some kind of tropical bird this way. Definitely a color palette you'd notice in a swarm of them. And that's it. The last of my starters for an ancient era. Thank you so much to everyone who subscribed over the last few weeks. I definitely didn't expect it, but I'm incredibly glad you all enjoyed my designs. I put a lot of time and work into making them and the videos, and to see people so excited over which one they'd pick and what was coming up next is something that was really fun and made the whole thing worthwhile. If you're new to the channel and you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll also consider subscribing and maybe leaving a like. Designs like these are something I'd love to make more of, along with a whole sundry of other art-related video ideas I've got tucked away. The next thing I want to try is something one of my friends approached me about a while back, creating Pokemon together based off of the same theme, and seeing what we both end up with. If we can figure out how to get that set up between the two of us, you'll probably see it pop up sometime over the next few weeks. In the meantime, I'm going to take a small break to recoup and let my hands rest, and to partake of a bit of lethal company. But I do have one last question for you all. Now that you've seen them, which one would you choose?